are not attached to historical persons at all. Rather, these gods are merely symbols for the passage of the seasons. As in winter the god dies, and then in spring he comes back to life again as the new crops come up and the spring brings new birth again. These are merely symbols for the passage of the seasons. And it would be simply unthinkable for the original disciples to believe that their compatriot, Jesus of Nazareth, was risen from the dead on the basis of these myths about dying and rising seasonal gods. But in any case, secondly, there was simply no causal link between these supposed parallels and the disciples' belief in the resurrection of Jesus. Indeed, there is actually no trace at all, historically, of these myths of dying and rising gods in first century Palestine, so that the disciples simply had no contact with these sorts of things, and therefore the causal link is simply missing. Thirdly, what about Jewish beliefs in the resurrection? Well, again, I've described a moment ago how radically different from the resurrection of Jesus the Jewish beliefs about resurrection were. In fact, Joachim Jeremias, a famous German New Testament scholar, has said that there is nothing in ancient Judaism which is even comparable to the resurrection of Jesus. Given their Jewish beliefs about life after death and so forth, confronted with the crucifixion of Jesus, at most the disciples could have simply kept their master's tomb as a shrine, preserved his bones until the day of the resurrection at the end of the world, when they would hope to be rejoined with him and all the righteous of Israel in the kingdom of God. But given their Jewish beliefs, they would not have come up with the absurd idea that God had raised him from the dead already. So that none of these factors serve to account for the origin of the disciples' belief that God had raised Jesus from the dead. We have here a belief which nothing in terms of antecedent historical influences can account for. And therefore it seems to me that the best explanation for the origin of this belief and the origin of the Christian movement itself is that the belief was true. Jesus did rise from the dead, and that explains the origin of the Christian faith.
What evidence is there for the empty tomb?
In my book, I lay out about 10 lines of evidence for the empty tomb, so I couldn't possibly hope to summarize it all here. Let me just mention a couple of points. One of the most important facts, I think, undergirding the empty tomb is, oddly enough, the burial story of Jesus. If the burial story of Jesus is accurate, then that means that the site of Jesus' tomb was known to both Jew and Christian alike in Jerusalem. But if that is the case, then it seems to me that the inference that the tomb was found empty is very near at hand. For if the burial site of Jesus were known, then it would have been impossible for the disciples to believe in the resurrection of Jesus and proclaim this in Jerusalem when Jesus' corpse still lay in the tomb. If Christianity or the resurrection was preached in Jerusalem itself, as it was, the very city where Jesus was publicly executed, where his grave remained and was publicly known, the disciples could not possibly have believed that he was risen from the dead in the face of a closed tomb. And even if they had, scarcely anybody else would have believed in them if they proclaimed anything so silly. For a first century Jew, the idea that you could have a spiritual resurrection while the corpse still lay on the tomb was simply unknown. That is an invention of 20th century theology, not first century Judaism. And in any case, the Jewish authorities certainly could have made an end to the whole affair by simply pointing to the closed tomb of Jesus and said, look, that grave is occupied, he is not risen from the dead, and that would have been the end of it. And therefore, the accuracy of the burial story, I think, provides powerful grounds for affirming the historicity of the empty tomb account. And unfortunately, for those who wish to deny the empty tomb, the burial of Jesus is widely recognized to be one of the most historically credible facts that we have about the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth. So that those who deny the empty tomb are also forced to deny the burial story, which is a desperate expedient since it is so historically well attested. So that would just be one aspect. Another aspect of the empty tomb narrative itself, as it's found in the Gospel of Mark, is that this portion of the narrative was probably part of Mark's early source material that he used for describing the passion and the death of Jesus, the last week of Jesus' life and his crucifixion. The burial story marked the close of the passion of Jesus as he is laid in the tomb and the stone is rolled across its entrance. And the empty tomb story was probably part of that passion story, because that story would not have been circulated without victory at its end. Without the empty tomb, the passion story is incomplete. Also, the empty tomb story is connected to the burial account by syntactical and linguistic ties. For example, the pronouns used in the empty tomb story have their antecedents in the burial story, so that it's really one smooth account. Now, when you remember that Mark is the earliest of our Gospels, that means that his source material was even older. And this passion narrative that included the empty tomb story could have gone back to within the AD 30s even. Remember, Jesus was crucified about AD 30. So that we're talking about a source that is extremely old and is therefore a valuable source of historical information. Also, the empty tomb story itself, thirdly, is extremely simple and lacks any signs of legendary development. I think the best way to appreciate this would be to compare it to accounts of the empty tomb that are found in apocryphal Gospels, that is, forgeries dating from the 2nd century, such as the so-called Gospel of Peter. In the Gospel of Peter, the narrative describes the resurrection of Jesus itself coming out of the tomb. The narrative proceeds by saying that during the night there is a loud voice that rings out from heaven, and then the stone across the entrance to the tomb rolls back by itself. Then 2 men are seen coming out of heaven and going into the tomb. Then 3 men come out of the tomb, 2 of them holding up the 3rd man. The heads of the 2 men stretch up to the clouds, but the head of the 3rd man overpasses the clouds. Then a cross comes out of the tomb, and a voice from heaven asks, "Hast thou preached to them that sleep?" And the cross answers, "Yea." Now, these are how real legends look. You see, they're colored by all sorts of theological and apologetical motifs. And these are noticeably lacking from the Mark and empty tomb account, which seems to be basically a straightforward report of what actually happened. If I might just mention a couple of other points that I think are significant. The empty tomb was probably discovered by women. And I think that this is evident when you contemplate 2 aspects of the role of women in 1st century Jewish society. First of all, women occupied, quite frankly, a low rung on the Jewish social ladder. They were second-class citizens in 1st century Palestine. This is evident from such Jewish rabbinical sayings as the following: "Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women." Or again, "Woe to him whose children are female, but blessings on him whose children are male." Women were not as highly regarded as males in that society. Secondly, the witness of women was regarded as so worthless that they were not even allowed to serve as witnesses in a legal court of law. If a man were seen committing a crime by a group of women, he could not be convicted on the basis of their testimony because their witness was thought to be so unreliable that it wouldn't even be admitted into court. Now, in light of those 2 facts, how remarkable must it be that the empty tomb story describes the discovery of the empty tomb by women. The fact that it is women rather than men who discover Jesus' tomb empty suggests that this is a historically credible account. Any later legend would have certainly made the male disciples to discover the empty tomb, Peter and John, for example. The fact that it is women that discovered the empty tomb, women whose witness was worthless and counted for nothing, is best explained by the fact that, like it or not, they were the ones who found the empty tomb, and the Gospels faithfully record this fact.